I just need to get my little video recorded here. And we are being recorded, so. Okay, tonight we welcome Eileen Horne, the co-author, along with Dr. Gwen Adshead, of the book, The Devil You Know, Stories of Human Cruelty and Compassion. Eileen is an American author and dramatist currently based in California with an MA in creative writing from the University of London. Following a career in the UK as an independent TV drama producer, over the last decade, she has written an eclectic mix of historical nonfiction, journalism, Italian translation, as well as several original dramas and literary adaptations. This includes contributing to a BBC radio drama series about an entirely fictional female forensic psychiatrist. Please welcome Eileen Horne. Hello, Eileen.
Hi there.
And joining her in conversation tonight is journalist Matt Kettmann, the senior editor of the Santa Barbara Independent and a contributing editor for Wine Enthusiast. Matt's also written about wine for the New York Times, Time Magazine, Smithsonian, and Wine Spectator. Late last year, he collaborated with photographer Macduff Everton on an extensive book about wine in Santa Barbara County. It's called Vines and Visions, The Winemakers of Santa Barbara County. Please welcome Matt Kettmann.
Thanks, Mike.
All right, go ahead and take it away.
All right, yeah, as Mike said, I'm Matt Kettmann. I've been at the Independent for like 20 years or so, and I wrote for a number of other publications. Also wrote my first book, which you mentioned, and Chaucer's was nice enough to have Macduff and I on the show, I don't know, a few months ago when that came out. So I'm excited to be back and talk to Eileen Horne. So we're going to learn all about her book. And, you know, I worry too much about wine, so I'm not necessarily a forensic psychiatrist buff. So the way that I found out about Eileen's book is that she's my neighbor near Goleta. She lives right across the cul-de-sac. And one day she came over and said, hey, I have this great book coming out. It's already getting big press in the UK, and you should check it out. And so she gave me my copy. She gave me my copy right here, which I just actually saw your Post-it note in here to me about it. It's still in there. It was my bookmark during the whole time reading it. And then I wrote a big story, a cover story. We put Eileen on the cover, her big mug on the cover of the Independent to promote the book. You're welcome. To promote the book and learn all about it. So that's what you guys are here for today. So Eileen, why don't you tell us a little bit about the book, how it came to be, and I know we have the doctor herself is ready to read the first few paragraphs for us, and we can get into more of your background and more about the big picture of this book. So tell us about The Devil You Know.
Thanks so much, Matt, for all your help, and thanks to Chaucer's as well. I've spent many happy hours of my life sitting on the floor between the stacks there, reading and buying books, and I just love that bookstore so much. So it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here with you. The Devil You Know is a collaboration, as you can see from the cover, between myself and a doctor, a forensic psychiatrist, one of the most eminent people in her field, perhaps in the world. She has been doing the job for 30 years, mainly at Broadmoor, which is a hospital, a secure hospital for violent offenders. And she not only assesses people and testifies to their state of mind in court, but she also, fascinatingly to me, gives therapy to violent offenders, including people who are multiple homicide perpetrators or serial killers to you and me, and many others. And for many years, she had been telling me, we're just friends. I don't work with her or anything normally, but for many years, she had been telling me that she wanted to write a book about her work. And this came about finally when I got sick of her talking about it. I hate it when people say someday I'm going to write a book. So I said, let's just get on with it. Let me help you do it. I'll interview. She was afraid she couldn't find a voice or write a book for a general audience because she's an academic, really. So I said, you tell me your stories and I'll put them down.
And that's something we'll get into too, because you're not like Dr. Gwen with Eileen. I mean, you definitely are the co-writer of this book, and you know, you took her experiences and turned it into that, into what it is. And we'll talk a little bit about that process, because I think it's fascinating as a writer myself, and I bet the readers will like to hear it too. But maybe we should go to Dr. Gwen for her reading the first few chapters of the book.
Yep.
Hello, Santa Barbarians. I'm Gwen Adshead, and it's a great pleasure to be with you. And thanks to Chaucer's Bookstore for inviting me and Eileen. I say me, but of course I'm probably fast asleep at the time that this is going ahead, so I'm handing over to Eileen to tell you about our book. But I thought I might set the scene by reading out some of the introduction of our book. Here it is, The Devil You Know. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the first 3 paragraphs just to set the scene. In that distant time, when people on aeroplanes used to talk to each other, I'd sometimes get asked what I did for a living. I'm a psychiatrist and psychotherapist who works with violent offenders, I would reply. Mild curiosity would shift to amazement. You mean you actually talk to those people? This could lead to an impromptu lecture about what a waste it was to bother with such monsters. Or I'd get more of a bemused, but they can't be helped, aren't they born that way? The occasional British fellow traveller might lean in and offer sotto voce, frankly, I think Parliament ought to bring back hanging. Nowadays, on the rare occasions when anyone starts up a chat while we're fastening our seatbelts, I'm inclined to tell them I'm a florist. But I think that everyone who is both fascinated and repelled by human cruelty deserves a better and more honest response about the treatment of violence and those who perpetrate it. And that is my aim with this book. The title comes from the Latin proverb which suggests that the devils we know are less risky than the ones we don't. If my fellow travellers were a therapy group, I might test out their symbolic thinking skills by asking them to consider this saying and what it suggests to them. I'd have high hopes of a hypothetical aeroplane seatmate therapy group, likely a chatty, sociable bunch. We could open up a discussion by talking about the familiar devils of religion or fantasy. What about the devil we don't know? I might prompt. Who is that for you? Obviously, it's something alien, someone might offer, like one of those terrible people you work with. In time, I hope the group would come to discover that it could also signify a cruel and belittling self that lives in all of us. Accepting that won't come easy for some. To paraphrase the beautiful words of Lear's daughter, we ever but slenderly know ourselves. In the following stories, I will show what it is that my colleagues and I do with those people, and how and why listening and compassion can make a difference. I don't judge those who might disagree, just as I don't judge my patients, and I completely understand why people have strong opinions about my work. Everyone is fascinated by what we call evil, that human capacity for violence and cruelty. More than enough proof of this is found in the mirrors that are our news and entertainment media. Even as global data show violence of all kinds trending steadily ever downward in the modern era, our appetite to know more about it has increased. I include myself in this. I chose this career after all. And that's where I'm going to leave it. I hope you enjoy the event, and now I'm handing over to Eileen.
Great. I love that she started with that because, I mean, it's the start of the book, obviously, but it really sets the stage, and I'm sure this was a lot of your handiwork, sets the stage for what the book's about, which is not just these kind of lurid tales of criminals, but really getting into how they became violent, all of these things that conspired to push them into that final act of violence. And I like a lot of the metaphors that are used, including the bicycle lock, where all of the things have to come together. And to me, it really, and this is what I wrote in an article, it's really serves as kind of this antidote to this pop culture understanding we have of criminal violence, which is like these people are either born monsters or somehow, one thing flips them over, where it's really a complicated stories. So, I mean, is that what you thought was going to happen when you started to work on this book with Gwen, or were you just more fascinated by the stories she would tell? I mean, how did it merge into this book that's about a much bigger picture than just kind of what could have been an easy book about, you know, fairly lurid stories, probably would have sold well too. But what did this evolve over the course of writing the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think all books, as you know, evolve over the course of writing. You have one plan and it becomes something else. I guess originally I assumed it would be a little bit more like a medical memoir, and I might be more like a ghostwriter, just helping my friend write this story. And when we were first crafting the book proposal, I kept saying, okay, so why did you become a doctor? And give me a timeline. I mean, I knew some of it because we're very old friends, but, you know, at what point did you decide to go into psychiatry as a specialism, blah, blah, you know, and I was sort of building up a profile. But first of all, as you can kind of tell even from that video clip, she's a rather modest, wonderful woman, but just really nothing's about her. She's all about the work itself and the patients. And so she kept thrusting forward stories as we were talking about, you know, if you like, the memoir shape. And I realized it wasn't that. I love that books and writing are so organic that way. It was just clear to me that that's not what it was. A really important factor, however, was that I come from a background in television and film and writing drama. And I guess what I began to hear as I listened to her, almost in like our roles were reversed, you know, in the sense I was like her therapist and she was telling me her stuff. I began to hear the voices of some of the people that she was describing, or different groups of people she was describing. I remember her talking about Munchausen's by proxy, generally mothers who harm their babies. And she talked about a handful of them. And I could almost see one, you know, emerging through the mist. And I thought, maybe the way forward is to actually write stories about patients, change their names, you know. I mean, didn't Freud do that? That'll be okay. And she went, oh God, no, we can't do that. I mean, even if I could get some of their permission, which, you know, would be doubtful. Some of the people she was talking to me about were long dead, for example. I can't do that. It's ethically, legally, morally wrong to profit from pain. It would be harmful to the victims' families, to the victims if they're still alive, and even the families of the perpetrators. There's no way I can do that. And I said, well, what if we make a combination? And that's how this idea of, and using my dramatic skills, I suppose, my experience in character, let's take those 5 women who had their children through Munchausen's by proxy, and let's call her Sharon, not a real person. And I'll come up with a description of what she looks like. And don't tell me what any of the real ones look like, so that we can never be accused of writing about someone real. And then everything else should be absolutely clinically accurate and based on your experience. So it's still nonfiction, but I suppose some people might call it creative nonfiction.
And that must have been, I mean, freeing. It allowed you to follow different storylines into one storyline and really make dramatic chapters, because there are, I mean, it's 11, 12 chapters that are based on these kind of, I think you call them composite characters, essentially. So was that, as a writer, was that something that kind of opened more doors than you probably expected to get into when doing this book?
It's a great question. I mean, to be honest, it was sort of terrifying. I can remember sending very anxious late night emails to our agent and to Gwen going, well, I don't think we can call this nonfiction if I'm making things up, and this can't be right. You know, I'm very nervous. Every single thing, I want you to back it up with a factual story that I can keep in my file. But everyone told me to relax, that lots of doctors write about their patients and make composites. Lots of professionals in all sorts of fields do that. So I wasn't, you know, inventing the wheel.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you probably wouldn't see many medical memoirs at all if they were relying on actual patients. So,
yeah.
And so
the point is, sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, the point is really to get across that she has sat in rooms with, let's say, 5 of those women. It's obvious from her expertise and her credentials. So everything she's saying is weighted with truth.
And I assume that must include the drama that she goes through personally herself. I mean, there's some incidents in the book where her own safety kind of comes into question, which is probably happened a million more times than is depicted in this book. But that was really happening to her too, where she was starting to be stalked herself, or starting to realize that there were violent things that were maybe about to happen to her as well.
Well, less than you would think.
Yeah.
You've used the word lurid a few times, one of my favorite words. But actually, it's not a lurid book for anyone who's watching and wondering if they can bear to read some gross thing about the details of serial killing. It's really not that. It's much more like that television program In Treatment, where a therapist is sitting with a person in a room, extracting their life story and its meaning from them. And each chapter is like a little sort of short film about someone's experience in therapy and how they do or don't change. It's really not set in, dark alleys or dungeons or terrible, places from true crime dramas on Netflix. So yeah, it doesn't really happen that she is in danger very much. One of the most surprising things she ever said to me in the course of drafting the book and planning the book was that she was much more afraid in the community than she ever was in Broadmoor. And Broadmoor, which looks like this sort of great Gothic, prison, is a kind of mythic place in the English imagination. I know most people here may not have heard of it, but I said, I can't believe that. I mean, there's all these, crazy people and killers in there, in my stupid way. And she quickly said, look, we know where the risk is, so we're prepared for it. There are alarm buttons everywhere. It's very staffed up. It's very protected. Nobody can possibly get their hands on a weapon. But also, and this is a really important point, she said, if I'm sitting with someone who's, let's say, committed a really terrible murder, I don't know, killed their grandmother or something, some awful, awful thing in a particularly lurid way, that doesn't mean they want to kill me too. Murderousness is not the same as addiction. You kill someone because you have a reason to kill them, even if it's a fabricated one or one that stems from some kind of mental illness or misconception, not because they're sitting in front of you. Murderers don't just run around lashing out and killing everyone as a general rule. That I learned writing this book.
Right. Well, and it's right there in the subtitle too, that compassion really is kind of what you're left with when you read these chapters. You start to feel, I don't know if saying feeling sorry for serial killers or, child molesters or women who hurt their babies. Feeling sorry is probably the wrong word, but you at least start to understand how they got to where they were. And it wasn't just some magical switch that got flipped or some born into monstrosity situation. And that's, I think, a really strong part of the book. But let's hear how you wound up in England and made friends with Dr. Gwen in the first place. I mean, you grew up in Goleta, right?
Absolutely, about 2 blocks from where we're sitting now, in a big family, in a little house. Sometimes I walk past there on my suburban walks these days, and I can't believe my parents crammed that many children into one house.
Have you ever stopped and said hi or no?
Yeah, I have. I actually, one time I nearly got up the nerve to say, can I come in? But actually, I don't think I want to go in. I want to preserve it in my memory. It's probably just a lot smaller than I remember it.
Right. And then, but then you moved to Europe fairly young.
Well, first we moved to the East Coast, and then when I was about 15, we moved to Rome, where I sort of became Italian overnight and fell in love with the country. We all showed up there in kind of denim jackets and Led Zeppelin t-shirts, being very kind of 1970s kids. And within a week, my mum used to say, I transformed to turn Italian. I just loved it. It felt like my spiritual home, and it still is to this day. And I still have a house there and consider it my permanent home.
Right. And then what was the path to London?
So I must tell you, the first time I ever went to London was when we were at school in Rome. We went to an international school, and there was a field trip to London. And I can vividly remember sending a postcard back home to my best friend in Rome saying, London is terrible. It rains all the time, and the guys are so ugly. I'm here to testify that that's still true to this day. I didn't ever expect to end up there. I thought I would end up here. I came back here and started university. I really wanted to study English at the University of California. There was this amazing Shakespeare professor in Santa Barbara, which some of your listeners, viewers may know. Homer Swander, he was a real legend in Santa Barbara, and I took all of his classes twice. I thought he was so brilliant. And he helped me to get to England. He gave me a scholarship to go to summer school there 1 year. And I just stayed. I actually transferred and ended up finishing my education at the University of London and graduating there.
And with the goal from the beginning of being a writer, right? I mean, that's why you wanted to come study English here and why you wound up in London. I mean, is that what you were going for?
Not sure that was my goal. I think I thought I might be a journalist at one point, or possibly the editor of the New York Times. I was a very grandiose child. But as time went on, I really wanted to work in the theatre. And when I first went to London, that was my goal. I started out directing plays in the London Fringe, you know, the sort of off Broadway. But I had a slight problem, which is that I hated actors. So that wasn't going to work out too well. And I ended up getting a job in television on the sort of script side, script editing, because lots of English majors go into that sort of area. And from there became a television producer and pursued that for about 20 years. I must say, at regular intervals, breaking away from the ugly guys and the rain to come back here and visit my family,
Right.
get some sun.
Right. And then you sold your TV production company, right? And kind of had a mid-career shift.
Let's call it a midlife crisis. Come on.
Right.
Yeah. I about 10 years ago, I got out of television. It was overwhelming and stressful. So much so I became quite unwell for a while, and I left it behind. And I did something I'd always wanted to do. And I must tell you, if I can inspire anybody who's watching, it's a really good idea. If you hit midlife, to think about what you really always wanted to do and do it if you possibly can. And that was to do an MFA, to do a creative writing master's degree. And I found one at the University of London and chose the module, which was about nonfiction writing and memoir. I was really interested in true stories. And I think that sort of was the path that began to lead me towards Gwen, although I couldn't possibly have known that at the time.
Right. How did you actually meet Gwen? Was it a personal friend of a friend? What was the actual connection to begin with?
The actual connection was through her younger sister, who was a good friend of mine. I'd met through friends in London. We've been pals for years. Laura was this beautiful, glamorous advertising executive, and we used to pal around and go shopping together. And then one day, Laura told me she'd had a vocation, that she wanted to become a Benedictine nun and go and live in a closed convent, which was a bit of a shock. And off she went. But because she'd made that extraordinary transformation, I began to talk to her, and to save all of our correspondence, we wrote copious letters, actual letters with paper and pen, thinking one day I'm going to write Laura's story, because that's an incredible, life change. And why does a contemporary woman at age 40, become a nun? Anyway, when I went to the ceremony where she was, I guess, inducted, or whatever it's called, into the convent, Gwen was there. And my first sight of Gwen, this is 15 years ago or something, was singing in Latin for her sister. And she has the most beautiful soprano voice, as you can possibly tell by her reading voice. She just has a lovely voice. And I went over to her and I said, "Oh, I can replace Laura. You've lost your sister to the convent, but can I be your sister?" And we became pals after that. And ever since then, we've been very close friends.
Is Laura still a nun?
Oh, yes, she is.
Wow.
And I've been to visit her. It's a closed convent, so you go and see her behind a grill, and look through, and we put our fingers through the grill and kind of hold fingers rather than holding hands. But she's very, very happy in her vocation, and I'm happy for her.
And did Gwen think that was a usual? I mean, as someone who studies people's mindsets, did she think that was a usual path to take, or?
She was so encouraging of Laura. She could tell that. I remember that day at the ceremony. It looked like Laura was lit from within. She just had the call, and so of course Gwen's a loving sister, and she supported her in that.
Right. And so, tell us how you got on the path to doing the book with Gwen. You mentioned she would tell you stories. You were fascinated by them.
Mm.
What steps were there to actually making this come to life?
Well, she had been telling me that she was, as I said at the beginning, that she was going to write a book someday. And I'm a sort of human doing. I really, if you tell me you're going to do something, cook something or build something, I'm going, come on, I'm your cheerleader. I want you to do it. And every time I would see her, which was, pretty often, let's say we would get together for tea or something once a month, she would still be saying, yeah, I'm going to do this. And eventually I said, what's it going to be called? And she said, oh, I'm going to call it A Short Book About Evil. And an academic publisher is interested in it, and it's going to be like a series of essays drawing on the works of St. Augustine and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, really? Who's going to read that? But anyway, I encouraged her to go and do it. And when it didn't materialize, as I was saying, I said, look, there has to be a better way. And she was so grateful, as anyone who's ever tried to write a book and not written it might imagine, having a human dervish whirl into their living room with a pen and a pad in hand going, tell me, I'll help you, was, gratefully received.
And it was, I mean, from what you've told me before, the publishers, once you guys got the kind of gist together, they were pretty excited about it. I mean, you guys, this is a big book. This is not a, self-published thing. This is something that's published by some of the biggest publishers in the world. So that must have been exciting, first off, and then
bit of a shock. It was quite a shock. I remember sitting with Gwen in a cafe in central London a few years ago, and we'd written the book proposal. I already had an agent because I've written other books, and I said, look, Sophie thinks it's pretty good. Let's just do what she wants us to do, one more draft. And Gwen said, look, I have an awkward question. I'm a National Health Service doctor. I'm a single mother with 2 boys, as you know. I can't really do unpaid work for months at a time and take a sabbatical, or I just really can't. Do you think we'll get paid? And I said, oh, well, yeah. I mean, nonfiction, we might get 10 grand or something like that. And over time, if we're lucky. Cut to, 2 months later, my agent is on the phone going, oh my God, we've had 13 offers from every major British publisher. And pretty soon after that, we'd sold it to 15 other countries around the world, including the US, in a big deal with Scribner, which is part of Simon & Schuster. So it was a bit of a surprise, a welcome surprise, but also a lot of pressure, like, now you better bloody deliver.
Right. So did you find yourself having to write for 2 audiences? I mean, are English readers more or less the same as American readers? I mean, obviously they're going to have a little more, it's going to resonate more with them because they know Broadmoor, they know perhaps the doctor herself and, in name, whereas Americans don't know those touch points. But obviously we're all interested in similar human stories. But how did you kind of figure that out, or did you have that concern at all?
I didn't really have that concern. I don't think that any writer should write books for a market. You've got to write what you're burning to write. You've got to write what you know, that old cliche. The fact that the 2 of us were doing it together inevitably would make it more accessible, I think, to an American audience. Although Gwen has, a lot of contacts in the States. She's taught at Yale. She's part of the International League of Forensic Psychiatrists, which is based in America. She's not a complete alien and is somewhat known here, at least in her field. But she doesn't think like an American, So, for example, a lot of my questions to her, I think, though I'd lived in England for 30 years, came from an American sensibility, which I've never lost. So I was going, well, is it free when you give therapy to these guys? I was asking very down-to-earth American questions. But I was also saying things like, what do you think about shooters? Because we don't really have many in England. What do you think about all these shooters? Or why do you think there are so many more serial killers in America than in England or elsewhere? And she would elaborate or make a guess at the answers to that. She always says, I don't know, but here's what I surmise based on my experience. And I put all of that in the book. If she'd co-written it with, let's say, a colleague of hers or, I don't know, a British ghostwriter or something, I can imagine that some of that stuff wouldn't have made it into the book. And the American publisher, when they bought the book, they said, we're so glad you're on board. We have no problem with you on the front cover with her in equal credit, because you're going to be US friendly and translate it for an American audience, not just, cookies for biscuits and curtains for drapes and all the different weird quirks of language, but a kind of sensibility translation, perhaps.
and that still resonated with the English readers too. There was no conflict there.
Not at all. Not at all.
Right. And how's it doing? It came out in the UK a little earlier than it came out here, but when did it come out in the UK? In June, right?
Yes, it came out at the beginning of June. I'll never forget, the first great review, which I think was in the Times, in the Sunday Times, and it was just incredible. Like, you have to read this book. One of those books, I was like, it feels like my mother wrote this or something. It's so glowing and complimentary and profound. The person who wrote it had really understood the book, and they said it's changed the way I think about cruelty and violence forever. And it was really a great review. And I went, okay, well, then we can just die happy now, right? And then another one came, and another one. I'm so humbled and amazed by that. As a writer, I don't know about you, Matt, but most of us are very neurotic, and we think, okay, but the other shoe's going to drop any minute. There's going to be a horrible review in the Telegraph or something, but it didn't come. I mean, really, every major paper in Britain, Scotland, and Ireland has given it raves, and it's sold very well there. So fingers crossed for America.
Right, because it just came out this week, basically last
Yeah.
week.
Last week. That's right.
Yeah. And
I want to, Matt, can I just make a point about the different editions?
Well, I was about to say, I know you wanted to talk about it, but there's different covers. There's different covers for the American and the British versions. And we've talked about this being an interesting topic, but you and I have actually not talked about the interesting angles on it. So I'm curious to hear what the strategy was here.
Well, I also think, a Chaucer readership might be interested in how book covers come about and how much authors have a say in that. I imagine it varies from author to author and depends, on the publishing house and so on. But the first cover that we saw was the British cover, and I'm bringing it up because you probably caught a glimpse from it when Gwen was reading, because of the angle of her son's wobbly cam there. And it looks like this, which is really different from that. And as you can see, there's a kind of slightly scary looking boy on the cover, even though this isn't a book about violent children or anything. And this very bold print. And then the Americans came in with this, and I was kind of stunned, because I would have thought it would be, the other way around. To me, this looks like what I would imagine to be an American cover, in your face, it's kind of shouty capitals. And this, to me, looks much more like a novel or something, a kind of broody, interesting, intriguing novel cover. And quite beautiful. I mean, I really like both of them, but they're so different in color and style.
Did anyone explain the strategy to you?
Well, some of it is the house style of the different publishers. So Faber and Faber publish it in England, and they are quite known for a very graphic house style to their novels. They tried a figure, an adult figure, as a number of things. They were talking all the time, apparently, to the American publisher about what they were trying as well, trying to figure out the best way to capture this. They knew very early on that they wanted a person to be in some way involved, because these are humanizing stories about people, not a story about a concept or essays about evil. So they definitely wanted a person on there in some way or other. I was surprised that there was a boy, a little boy, but when Gwen saw it, she said, "Oh, that's perfect," because really everything begins in childhood. She would say that. She's a psychiatrist. And this is like the child that became the man, who is the subject of so many of these stories.
Right. And there are men that are subject. There's actually quite a few women that are subject to these stories too, which is, I think, probably enlightening to a certain readership as well. I mean, was that intentional to kind of keep a somewhat of a balance between genders, or that was just the interesting stories kind of led that way?
Gwen felt very strongly about it. In the last 5 years, as well as working at Broadmoor, she's been doing some part-time work in a women's prison with violent women. And she said, she really feels like it's something, particularly in Britain, that isn't that much talked about, that people would rather not think about women who are violent. And also, statistics tell us that it's 95% of violent offenders are male. So the caught ones are male, and 5% are female. And she spent a lot of time studying female violence, particularly maternal violence. And she has a hypothesis about that. Well, she has a number of them, which we get into in the book. But one of them is that women are just as violent as men, that their methods are not really all that different. I always thought women only poisoned, for example. And she said, don't be silly. Stop reading Agatha Christie. And, it was more that it took more factors to combine. You were talking about the bicycle lock earlier and how these different numbers or risk factors click into place, and men might have 5 and women might have 10 before fatal violence is released.
Right.
I found that very interesting, and that's why more female stories emerged. We felt it was really important to tell some of those women's stories and to look at some of the myths about female and male violence. Like every woman, there's a big mythology around every woman who commits a violent crime does it from a place of deep trauma. Well, hang on, what about the men? They probably had deep trauma too, but because of the way masculinity is sort of performed in modern society, we tend not to look at that so much. So the book attempts to sort of get under the skin of some of that and bust some myths.
Yeah, when you bust other myths too, like the fact that we have this impression that poor people commit crimes. Well, 99.9% of poor people don't commit crimes, and still with the same thing with mentally ill people that we have. Oh, they're mentally ill, but if you look at it, 99% of mentally ill people don't commit any crimes either. It's just the ones that get publicized, I guess. I mean, after doing this all, what accounts for? Why does pop culture want to ascribe these things so strongly? And maybe it's just American pop culture, maybe it's British pop culture, but yeah. No. But why do we just need reasons?
I think pop culture can be very lazy, and I say that as a former television producer. It's a whole hell of a lot easier to say, oh, in the end, we're going to reveal that Matt did the murders because he's crazy. He acted real normal for 6 episodes, but actually he's crazy. And boom, we're done. Roll credits. That to me is so simplistic. A big learning for me and for anyone who reads these stories is how complex the process is that takes someone to the point of cruelty, of harming another person or even killing them. So, yeah.
And in busting those myths, you also essentially propose, you call out a lot of underfunded, unfunded situations in both Britain and America. You lay out, not in any sort of policy statement, but you more or less lay out a framework for how you could start to fix these things from a societal, governmental level. Is there hopes that this could lead to policy changes?
Well, obviously, it was one of the reasons that we wanted to write the book. Anytime an expert can bring to bear thoughtful opinion and experience, they might influence policy. We've seen that countless times in our politics, in our governing, both in the UK, the US, and elsewhere. So, sure, but also I don't see how you can spend the time that Gwen has spent over the years with all of these people and not feel angry and really campaigning or being politically active. Very often comes from a place of righteous anger that people are treated so badly in our prison systems and way before they even get to prison, in the care system, and that children are so neglected, that education is so woeful and underfunded relative to, let's say, defense. And the world would be a much safer place if we intervened earlier. That's really Gwen's big mantra. In fact, she has a wonderful idea. I once said to her, if you were queen for a day, what would you do for all of these violent mothers that you've worked with? She's worked with so many women who have harmed and killed their children, which is really poignant to hear about. And she said, when you go for your first, and you probably don't know this, when you go for your first antenatal appointment, they give you folic acid because it's a nutrient that you need and a vitamin that you need. Well, I think they should ask a few assessment questions at the same time, and depending on your answers, they should offer you 6 therapy sessions about your feelings about motherhood, your own mother, and your own impending motherhood, and fatherhood too, but all for parental care, mental health care, before a baby comes along. She said, I reckon it would cut the work of family courts and, the number of care orders where children have to be removed from violent parents in half, like instantly.
Yeah.
That was
Well,
fascinating.
and it seems like when you bring up examples of how it works in Britain versus how it works in America, generally America looks like it works a lot worse. And we are a bigger country, more people. But do you think this book would have been much different had it been written about, or if Dr. Gwen was actually working in America more regularly? Or do you think our problems are more or less, no matter the root cause of it, our problems are more or less the same as what these characters are seeing in England?
So that's a complex question. And actually, I would say human nature is the same the world over. And the problems we face around mental health care are really similar. And the need for compassion is universal, and less condemnation and more understanding. But I don't think we could have written this book if Gwen had been American, for the simple reason that forensic psychiatrists in America do not give therapy and treat prisoners in America's prisons. Gwen has explained to me that there are little pockets where some groups will do, but as a rule, that's just not part of the system here. America has a mass incarceration rate, which is 20 times Britain's, more than that, I think, but also the largest in the world, in fact. But it also has an attitude since the 70s, really, of being all about punishment and not so much about rehabilitation, whereas the British system, though it's very flawed, and the British prison system is, terribly underfunded and overcrowded and not idyllic, is really based on a mission statement of rehabilitation. So that's a kind of stark difference, and it means that there aren't any Gwens, or very few, I think, in America running around offering that kind of long-term therapy to violent offenders.
Right.
So the book couldn't have been written here, really.
Yeah. We have some good questions from the crowd, and we'll get into those in a second. But did you, in going through this, and mental health is a topic now that is, I think, talked about a lot more in the last even 5 to 10 years than it has been, any time before that. But still, there's obviously tons of problems out there. Did you get a sense of optimism in working on this book over time, or were you the same, or were you more pessimistic? I mean, what was your general sense when you were done with this book about the state of how we treat mentally ill people and how we try to prevent crime before it happens?
Obviously, there's some pessimism there because there's so little will. We can blame politicians, but every country gets the politicians they deserve. We vote for them, and if we live in a democracy, and so we get what we deserve. And it's our fault. It's every one of our fault if people are being treated badly, or children are not being helped early enough to set them on the right path. It's every one of our responsibility, I believe. So in that sense, one could say it's a pessimistic picture, but there's a glorious optimism that runs through the entire book. And in fact, I was really proud that Sister Helen Prejean is one of the people who wrote us a blurb, if you turn over and look at the back of the book, who wrote Dead Man Walking, and who's a great advocate for ending the death penalty in America, as many of you will know. And she said, hope infuses every word, or something like that. Hope infuses every story. And it really does. And the hope lies in the possibility of change. And every story demonstrates how the work that Gwen's doing, helping people to tell their stories, to make sense of the senseless things they've done and move forward, less risky, safer people, is hopeful. And I'll just end with this. Faber, who are a small but amazing publishing house in England, have a tradition, which I find touchingly British and lovely, which is that they give all of their employees a day off work to read a book every month or two, one of their forthcoming books. And then they have like something like this, a sort of a book club with all the employees coming on Zoom. And Gwen and I went along after, from the receptionist up to the CEO, and they all came on and asked questions and so on. And at the end, the moderator said, Eileen, Gwen, do you have any questions for us? I mean, we're about to publish the book. And I said, well, if you had to sum up what you felt when you finished reading the book in a word, what word would you use? And this young woman said very quietly, I think hope. And then someone else next to her in the little Hollywood square next to her said, yeah, hope. And someone else said hope. And suddenly there was this chorus of hope. It was really one of the best moments in the whole publication process for me.
Yeah. Well, I think you are, as a reader myself of the book, you are left, despite going through these kind of traumatic incidents, you are left hopeful that at least there's one doctor out there who's focused on compassion and on change, and could really inspire a lot of others, and if not whole systems, to really kind of look at things in a light like that. So
yeah, I wanted to share with you that one of the people who recommends the book on the British edition is David Lammy, MP, who's a terrific Labour Party MP who's done a lot of work on criminal justice in the UK. And he says, this book makes an invaluable and urgent case for improved mental health care and could forever change the way we think about violence. And he's a leading politician, could be prime minister one day. So with that, well, I'm satisfied.
So let's look at our Q&A from the audience here. We have a cavelling sister here, no question, but presumably your sister's watching. And then there's a question that goes a little bit back to what we started in the beginning, and we talked about some of it. We might as well just ask it again. How do the characteristics of different criminal minds get selected and organized in one single character, chapter heading? What was that process like? So we did cover some of that, but did you have like certain types of crimes that you wanted to kind of make sure you clicked off the box, or how did you decide which composite characters you were going to use?
You know, Matt, I just came at it like you would. I said, okay, hit me with a serial killer. I want to know about stalkers. At a certain point, Gwen said, you haven't asked about child sex offenders. And I said, do we have to do that? And she said, well, it has been an important part of my work, not so much in Broadmoor, but she had spent some time in her training and in the early years of her career get this, in group therapy with child sex offenders, conducting groups of men who had all done something to their children. And she had a lot to say about that, about the pathology of it, but also about the possibility for change and intervention in that very tricky, very tough area. So we did include a chapter about a child sex offender, which for me was the hardest one to write. But really, I just asked for.
More uncomfortable to read too.
Is it? Yeah, I bet it is. You can skip that one if that alarms you. But really, I just asked about all the types, I suppose, that I was familiar with, not from my long and interesting study of criminology, but kind of from watching TV and reading detective fiction.
Right. This one's from TT. She bought the book, loves it so far. I imagine your book elicits a variety of opinions. Have more extreme views come against this compassionate approach?
Well, I mean, that's quite interesting. We were talking about this before the event began tonight. You know how Gwen in the introduction says sometimes people say to her on planes, I think Parliament should bring back hanging. The British abolished the death penalty in a very civilized fashion about 50 years ago. But there is a contingent of people in Britain who think we should bring back hanging, and a few of them like to write comments on Amazon and on the Guardian letters page. So yeah, we have had some pretty extreme reactions and some really weird emails, because Gwen is part of a medico-legal chambers where she does her legal work, appearances in court as an expert, and so she has an official email on their website, and of course with a couple of clicks through Google you'd find that. And so some pretty strange and interesting people have written with some comments for her. But also, just on a very serious note, we had an incredible bit of feedback from a woman who said, after reading your book, I have the courage, particularly because of one story. I want your help and your advice. I have the courage to go and visit in prison the man, a family friend of ours, who killed my brother. I want to forgive him. I was so moved when I saw that email. If the book had done that for that woman, we never need sell another copy. I mean, how extraordinary.
Oh, that's great. And then the last one we have from the crowd right now is, after all the research you did did anything in your own personal attitude change toward violent criminals and where they came from? This is from Ruby.
I'm so glad you asked that question. Yes. So a lot of people watching this, if you're from the area, may be familiar with the book and the I thought, very good television series recently called, is it I'll Be Gone in the Dark, which was about the Golden State Killer. That's the name, yes. And it was about a writer who researched the Golden State Killer, who was recently arrested and imprisoned for all of these terrible rapes and serial killings in California in the, I think, 1980s, very near where we are now, like down the end of this street. And, at the height of lockdown, it came on HBO or whatever, and we sat down to watch it like you do. Let's see what serial killer is on tonight. And I was in the middle of writing this book, and I watched it, and I had this eerie sensation that I would never watch any of these shows in the same way again because of the time I'd been spending with Gwen. So I was watching it just like you might, and then in the very last episode, I believe, there's about 5 minutes where they talk about the serial killer's childhood, which was very traumatic. And then they gloss over that, and then he's in an orange jumpsuit, and he goes, and the credits roll. And I turned to my husband, and I said, we're writing the book that happens, or the film, if you like, that happens after the credits roll.
Right. And is there room for this book to become a movie or a series, or is that something that's...
Step right up, all you local Hollywood producers. No, we actually, at proposal stage, there was a bidding war for the film and TV rights, and a British production company bought the rights to make initially a television series, and that is in development with the BBC, and I think may go ahead next year. So that's exciting.
Great. And then TT has one more question, which I think is a good conclusion to all this, is how, after dealing with all of these people who, regardless of how they got there, are violent criminals, how does she stay so earnest and upbeat through all of it? What must be a traumatic job, essentially, on a daily basis.
People ask her that a lot. She talks about life-work balance. She talks about her mindfulness practice, which is really important to her. But most of all, she says, look, take a look at Broadmoor or the prisons I work in. They have big, high, thick walls. And, unlike most of us, I have a barrier that separates me from all that I hear inside the prison. When I go home from work, I leave the work behind the high walls and go home and watch cat videos on Facebook. That's what she usually says to that. She's an incredibly balanced woman. She says that she is able to leave her work behind, and that more than being fearful or disturbed by what she hears, she is saddened by it. She also has a lot of support. She works in a team and has a supervisor and is able to take her feelings about what she's hearing into supervision, and have therapy herself.
And did you feel any ill feelings or thoughts from dealing? You dealt with this stuff for a couple of years, I'm imagining, to put it into a book. Were you, I think you told me at one point your family was concerned about maybe you spending all this time with these stories and, this research. How are you doing through the whole thing?
Well, at one point, a good friend of mine who's married to a therapist in London said he's offering you free sessions every week if you need to unload about all of this. But for me, they were really stories, and I've written stories about all sorts of people and all kinds of situations. And I can separate myself and leave them, behind the wall of the computer when I close my computer at the end of the day. Although I'd really love to write a romantic comedy next. I think that's my plan.
And you did say for a while you started watching more comedy than your detective shows.
Yeah. I mostly out of a kind of disdain. After watching I'll Be Gone in the Dark, which I did think was very good, I thought I can't watch another one of those Scandi things where the serial killer is just a nutcase. I really have no patience with it. It wasn't so much that I was overloaded with fearsome feelings or images. I just thought they were stupid. So I'm afraid, warning folks, this book can ruin your Netflix viewing. But read it anyway. It'll change your life.
Great. Well, thank you, Eileen. This has been great. I think we're going to kick it back over to Mike and see what he's got to tell us about upcoming events.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks,
All
Matt.
I want to say is what a wonderful talk you both put. Matt, I'm glad you have a job because you would take my job. So thank you. You're a wonderful interviewer. Eileen, this has been an incredible talk. And I thank you for taking the time, and thank you for recruiting Gwen to talk to. I think that added hurt a lot. So please, everyone, buy The Devil You Know, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you, and good night, everyone.
Thank you all.